So I'd like to first introduce our second distinguished speaker, presenter, Father Chad Ripperger, who was born and raised in Casper, Wyoming. He has a bachelor's degree in both theology and philosophy from the University of San Francisco. He then earned a master's in philosophy at the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. While in seminary, he completed a master's in theology at Holy Apostles Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. He was sent to Rome to complete his doctorate in philosophy at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross. Upon ordination in 1997 with the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, he spent time at a parish in Omaha, Nebraska, and then was assigned to a teaching position at St. Gregory the Great Seminary in Seward, Nebraska, where he taught for 4 years. He also taught for 6 years at Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary in Denton, Nebraska, and subsequently he spent 3 years in a parish in Idaho. He is now the superior of a society that he founded called the Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother. They are also known as the Dolorian Fathers. Father Ripperger is a leading expert in spiritual warfare and exorcism, with many published works, including Deliverance Prayers for Use by the Laity, The Metaphysics of Evolution, The Principle of the Integral Good, and his latest book, Dominion, The Nature of Diabolical Warfare. You can find these books and many others at his website, sensustraditionis.org. You will also see him frequently interviewed on many Catholic podcasts and video channels, such as Sensus Fidelium. He is often quoted throughout Catholic media. He is a highly sought-after speaker and lecturer, while his education and years of diverse experience give his presentations a wealth of informative insight into the Catholic faith and tradition. So please, before I give the final welcome, I would like to ask you no recording. This is under license, so we have official recording and audio and video recordings that are going on, so I would ask you to please not record this, okay? But we are very, very grateful to have Father Ripperger this weekend, and I'd like to welcome back to Wisconsin, Father Ripperger.
Should we start with prayer? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be handed to Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. You know, when you follow Hugh at a conference, you kind of like want to just stop and say, yeah, what he said. Every time I listen to him, it's just fantastic. It reminds me in the scriptures where they talk about being on the road to Emmaus, and they're saying, wasn't one of our hearts burning, from what he was saying, how he was revealing the scriptures. For 3 to 5 years, maybe 4, we've been hearing the phrase as a mantra. We've heard it for a long time. We've been hearing the phrase as a mantra of trust the science. I believe the science. I believe in the science. Right? This is just at a time when you have people standing up who claim to be scientists or medical professionals who stand up in front of Congress and tell us that men can get pregnant. We were told in the 80s that we were going to go through actually this was in the 70s, I think, that we were going to go, that it was absolutely certain that unless we changed our ways, we were going to actually go through a global ice age. 20 years later, that didn't happen, of course. Then they tell us, well, now we're going through global warming. That didn't work. So now they're telling us now we're going through global climate change. But in each instance, they were cramming us down our throat as if it was dogma. Then, of course, you had the whole COVID thing come out. Oh, it'll only take 2 weeks to flatten the curve. These were all being told to us by scientists. right? And the problem is that what's happened now is that their credibility has gotten to the point where people just don't believe what they say, especially when they tell you, oh, eat potatoes, you're going to get cancer. Like, well, we have to eat bugs. We're all going to have to start eating bugs here pretty quick, right? Because we have to save the planet. As if God didn't design a system to handle the use of fossil fuels. Actually, there are any fossil fuels, some of them. So the point being is that science has basically entered into a crisis. And the reason I'm starting out with this is because there is a metaphysical impossibility, as we'll see as we get towards the end of the relationship to evolution. All of the problems that we're actually seeing in science now is actually present in the evolutionary hypothesis if you know what you're looking at. And this is the problem that we're actually dealing with, and to such a degree that when you start really analyzing evolution, you begin to realize that it's contrary to reason. You talked a little bit about it already. Part of it has to do with the fact that the science is obviously in a crisis. Science today appears to be under the control of financial interests, a political agenda. In fact, one of the things that's slowly coming out is that the funding of research in this country by the government is heavily dependent upon whether you accept their criteria and their understanding of certain things in the scientific community. And if you don't, there's no money. So it's no longer seen as an organized body of knowledge of things as their cause, as Hugh mentioned, that there's no longer seen that a science is something which it's an organized body, which means it deals with a particular object from a very specific point of view using a particular method. That's what a science is. And that means that a science, if you take it in its proper understanding of a knowledge body of things through their causes, the empirical sciences are not the only sciences. Hugh mentioned that theology is a science, but here's the real kicker. So is philosophy. If philosophy is not a science, we have a fundamental problem. And this is why. To define a thing is a philosophical endeavor, to define it, right? Obviously, we know it's a philosophical endeavor because the scientists can't even tell us what a woman is. Right? So obviously, a philosophical endeavor. So, if philosophy is not a science, and to define a thing is a philosophical activity, because you can't take a definition and put it in a lab to test whether it's true or not. It's the philosophical presuppositions that undergird a science that determine how it proceeds. It determines how we're going to actually look at this object. As I mentioned, a science has an object it studies. It looks at it from a particular point of view, and that point of view is very often determined by our philosophy. Let me give you an example. The notion of time dilation of Einstein is based upon Kant's understanding of time and matter and space. Kant. So that's where he got it. So the point being is that even the scientists all know it's the philosophy that undergirds this. But if philosophy isn't a science, and it's the one that defines things, then if we have a situation where it's not a science, then we can't have a scientific definition of science. That's what that means in the end. And all of this is basically why, because what's happened is over the course of time, we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along, but also tomorrow, is that the modern science began in the wrong place. In fact, the actual, by wrong place, I mean in the sense of the philosophical presuppositions that were adopted, ended up putting us in a situation where the empirical science has become at variance even with itself. It can't even conclude anything, it seems. The problem, if you look at the problem with the collapse of science to some degree, is very unfortunate because of the fact that just at a time when our technology has reached a certain stage, which is kind of a reflection of some of the science, but once it's reached a certain stage where we could be advancing the sciences in a tremendous amount of way, they're completely hampered by political agenda and profound philosophical error. That's what we're dealing with. Instead of actually studying things, you're actually more worried about, whether men can become mothers or not, right? So this collapse is ultimately in connection to a very specific principle, which I want to spend a little bit of time on. It's the principle of evidence. Now, if you actually look at Aristotle's discussion in his Metaphysics, but then also St. Thomas has a wonderful introduction to his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. In the beginning of that, St. Thomas says that if you actually look at metaphysics, it's actually broken down into 3 parts. The first part is the study of being, what a thing is. What does it mean for a thing to exist? What is an essence? The fact that an essence never changes. I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole thing in itself. Is itself an intrinsic denial of the evolutionary hypothesis? Because once it changes, it ain't that essence anymore. The second thing, and that's just one reason, but so it deals with the nature of being. The second one is natural theology. What we can know about God, the natural light of reason. You can actually know that God exists with certitude, and you can actually come to the knowledge of his 16 attributes purely by the natural light of reason without revelation. The last one is what we call first philosophy, and this is the philosophy that studies first principles. What's a first principle? It's one in which it's a proposition that once you hear it, as long as you have use of reason, you immediately understand that it's true. Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the first principles is called the principle of identity. A thing is what it is. Or another one is, a thing cannot not be and be in the same time in the same respect. That's called the principle of non-contradiction, which we boil it down to things can't contradict themselves and both be true. And we know that to be the case. Once you hear that principle and understand the terms of conversation, the intellect immediately gives assent to the truth of it. Well, one of the principles there's a whole series of principles. When I wrote the book, Metaphysics of Evolution, it was actually to start applying these principles, and then I also did it, which we're going to talk a little bit about, the principle of mutual good, which is being systematically denied by the, quote, greatest generation, unquote. This is one of the things we're going to talk about. But these principles are being systematically denied in the sciences itself, and it's rendering them irrational. And this is why when we see these things being said, anybody with just a modicum amount of common sense knows this is just not true. The thing is that once you understand the principles and start looking at evolution in light of that, you begin to realize even evolution is analogous to saying that a man can have a kid, right? This is one of the reasons I'm very sensitive to this whole thing. You get some guy standing there and his wife's pregnant, and he says, "We're pregnant." No, we are not. She is pregnant, you're expecting. Two entirely different things. But it's an indicator that our language has gotten so sloppy and lack of precision that it's creating a significant problem. So this principle of evidence, we're going to go into it in depth, but I want to talk first of all about how it collapsed and how it ended up affecting evolution. The problem began with Descartes, René Descartes. Now, he mentions him. René Descartes caused a lot of damage in philosophy. But one of the principal things he did is he started his entire philosophical endeavor on skepticism. And it was based in this. He said, if I take a stick and I stick it in the water, the stick looks like it's bent, but I know intellectually that it doesn't bend. Right? And so I can't trust my senses to tell me the truth. Now, look at what he just did. He separated the criteria from truth from reality and knowledge through your senses to purely what's in your own mind. That was the very beginning of that. I always tell people we put people in rubber rooms for what this guy became famous for. Okay. That skepticism then gets passed on. So then there's a guy by the name of Hume, I'm not going to go into it, you have this critique of causality. And so between Descartes' cogito, that is, I think, therefore I am, he wanted certitude. He wanted to found science as something that was absolutely certain, and so he started basically with mathematics, etc. But he basically started with, I think, therefore I am, which is actually not true. It's you are, therefore you're capable of thought. It's not that your thought means it proves anything. Okay, we'll see that in a minute. But this cogito, or this idea of Descartes and his skepticism, then led, coupled with Hume's critique of causation, resulted in Immanuel Kant saying that there's no way we can ultimately know reality. And because we can't know reality, because ultimately all I can know is my experience of reality. That became a cornerstone to modernism, the heresy of modernism. It's called the principle of evidence. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. But this problem of separating, so the evidence is what? It's facts. It's what we actually know to be the case. I can look at this floor and see what's around, right? And it's through my senses that I actually know it's true. The problem with Descartes was he didn't realize that his senses were telling him exactly the reality of what was going on. The reality that was going on is that the light was refracting. And so that refraction, it's telling you the light is refracting, not that the stick is bent. And that's actually, it's still reality that has to be the basis of truth. In fact, the definition of truth for the entire tradition of the church, or the tradition, philosophical tradition, it took a little while to get it fully formulated, but it was, when my intellect conforms to reality. It's when I know in my mind what is actually in reality. And what happens is when people use lucid reason, people become insane. Our culture is becoming insane, right? When it becomes insane, what a person believes is true is no longer what reality states it is, it's what they think is in their own mind. This is why Kant, in the end, said that what constitutes truth is when my thoughts just don't contradict each other. It's called the principle of coherence, which actually can be true to some degree, but in point of fact, we only know it's true when it's connected to reality. It's reality that you have to look at. And this is where the principle of evidence becomes so key. Because the principle of evidence is going to put into reality the foundation for what I assert as true or not, or whether my science is true or not. So this collapse, this separation, this led to the idea that philosophy could not provide any clear answers according to Descartes, and so we must turn to the empirical only. It gave excessive certitude to the empirical sciences. Well, that's breaking down. There are philosophical propositions that are actually more certain than 2 + 2 = 4. The principle of identity. If 2 ain't 2, then 2 + 2 don't equal 4. That's why that principle of identity, that 2 is 2, is more foundational than even mathematics. In fact, mathematics is founded on it. And yet, this was what was denied. So this disconnect from reality, which we now see in the empirical sciences, resulted in a specific kind of approach today, where they deny the principle of evidence. We're going to get to it. We see this in science, ignoring facts and evidence. They just ignore it, act like it doesn't exist. Where did this come from? It came from statistics. See, in statistics, what you do is that you poll, say, 1,000 people, or you just look at, say, 1,000 different kind of cases. And then from that, what you do is you create a bell curve. I'm sure you've all seen it or from it. And then what you do is there's certain statistics, there's certain parts of the data that just don't line into the bell curve, and so you simply drop them as anomalies, right? That can work in statistics if your idea is like, I just want to get a general idea of how many, what's the general percentage of people who actually think that, that Bible is true when he said, you might have the facts, but we have the truth. All right. So, I just wanted sorry. This is one of those things that I was howling for it. But you see that is the issue, right? What he said, actually, part of philosophy would actually agree with him. But in statistics, when it comes to the extremes, you simply drop that data and you focus only on the data that fits the bell curve. And so what happens is there could be error in the data. There could be a variety of different reasons why you would drop some of those information. Could be that just it wasn't the polling wasn't done properly, what have you. So there could be a variety of different ways why you drop the data that doesn't fit the bell curve. The collection of data, however, though, can also be selective. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the United States, they have the demographics mapped so accurately they can tell block by block in every street in this country the political tenor of that block. So much so that what they can do is, well, we want this politician, we don't want to make him look too good because then we know it's all ridiculous. So what we're going to do is we know that over in this part of the country, there's this percentage of people, so we're going to pull this, and then we're going to pull those areas to get the statistic we want. That's what we're seeing. That's why statistics in the 2016 election just flounder because it was all being done selectively. So even statistics can be manipulated by agenda. What I'm basically saying is in statistics, this can have a legitimate place, but obviously it can also be manipulated. So what's happened is in modern science, is they come up with a theory now, and instead of testing it, which they might do to some degree, but if they do test it, they'll make sure that the test is a control group that is specifically designed to get a specific outcome rather than just testing the thing and seeing how it actually works. Which, by the way, that idea of testing a thing to prove your hypothesis actually came from Saint Albert the Great. Most people are not aware of. So what happens though is that so what's happening in modern science is when the evidence contradicts the theory, they just drop it as an anomaly and then just move on and keep pushing their theory. Evolution, Freud didn't get everything wrong. I mean, that's most things wrong. But he didn't get everything wrong. His theory of projection is that I get something in my mind and then I project it on reality, and that's not what the reality actually is. But evolution is a case of projection. Because we can imagine things, but we are adding formality and finality into the causation of our own minds thinking about it into the existing reality. Let me give you an example. Every one of you, I think you just in fact showed it, where you start out with little animals and it goes up, and then you finally get to apes, and then humans, and so you see this progression, right? It's called the fallacy of overgeneralization. That's what that actually is. We think of how things would evolve, and then we look at the data set, we look at the different creatures that are alive, and then we arrange them in our own minds in a series and then say, well, this is how this happened. That has nothing to do with the reality of the situation. It has to do with us imposing form onto this thing that doesn't necessarily exist. It was the same problem with St. Anselm's ontological argument for God's existence. Just because I think of a God that could not possibly not exist doesn't mean that your proof works that he exists. You have to base it on other things. It's a logical, illicit move to go from what my mind thinks to reality. It has to be the other way around. Reality has to impose on my mind what the conformity has to be. So when you see this chart at the various stages of life, that and the implication is that man will evolve, and when man will evolve. You talk a little bit about that. That's why we have, this idea that even in theology, that everything's evolving. It's the fallacy of overgeneralization. Once the moorings of scientific reasoning is severed from reality, from the principle of evidence, then fraud is shortly on its heels. There was a guy by the name of Teilhard de Chardin. He was involved in what's called the Piltdown man. Now, Piltdown was basically a collection of bones they put together and said, this fits into these particular aspects of evolution in order to buttress and give stronger support to the evolution. The problem is, those bones weren't from the same animals. And and Chardin knew it. This guy was one of the most influential theologians at the Second Vatican Council, and he still is, even at the top of the church today. He was an absolute fraud. And this is what ends up happening. And so, this is one of the reasons why once you reject the first principles, once you reject reality as the basis of your science, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with fraud. And if you look at evolution, if you actually listen, there was a conference which I gave actually in this area. When I said, if you actually listen to the Freemasons when they were first listening to this, they said, no, this is true, this is all ridiculous. But we're going to use it anyway to our ends. This is why at the very root of evolution is fundamentally a rejection of first principles. And Aristotle said that if someone stops accepting the truth of a first principle, then they've lost use of reason. This is why we're seeing our country just out of its mind. And so as a result of that, he says, stop talking to them. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that we should actually engage in legitimate debate in relationship to evolution and things of this sort. But my basic point is that if in a discussion that someone is unwilling to accept first principles as being legitimately applied to the evolutionary hypothesis, you have to stop listening to them. Don't even argue with them because you're not going to get anywhere. It's literally like trying to argue with a madman. So what is the principle of evidence? It has different forms. The first formulation is the objective evidence of being is the criterion of the truth of assent. Okay, so it's objective reality. The evidence that you see in reality is the criterion of truth of assent. It determines whether I think the thing is true or not. This is why when they're sitting there telling us that women and men can have children, right, carry children to birth, you're just like, yeah, sorry, reality doesn't bear that out. And it is also, so it's reality, is also the motive for the certitude of the assent. So there's two things in this. The first is the degree of certitude. We see this in relationship to the following. Evolution and many scientific theories have gotten to the point where when you start looking at the actual hypothesis behind that, if you start looking at it, you actually have to assume a series of presuppositions. For example, you have to presume this replication happened in the manner that it did, that they suppose it did. You have to presume, right, that, as we'll see this a little bit later, that the principle of sufficient reason doesn't apply, that something lesser can give greater to something bigger. You have to make a number of different assumptions, even about the data. So when they present the data, like these were this level that you see the oceanic, oceanic, and then the small birds, and then the animals, you know, rather than the actual fact that the flood could have just wiped it out in a series of 4 stages, which would have been the next stratification. Right. But the certitude, and this is the thing that bothers me the most about when you hear these scientists talk, is the fact that they act like it's dogma. No, this is a hypothesis. This is not an absolute truth. The fact that they've been pushing it for so long just proves that Goebbels was right. They lied enough and people start to believe it. That's going to become a problem tomorrow when I'm going to start talking about why the clergy don't sign off on it. And the reason the clergy don't sign off on it is because it's on a habituation. They've just been lied to for so long. So if you actually look at evolution, it doesn't have the certitude proportionate to the way that they're saying that it does. But there's other scientific theories too. Once you start accepting evolution and you backtrack, then you got to go to the Big Bang. Well, the problem with the Big Bang is, especially in light of the James Webb Space Telescope, which is starting to find full-blown formed galaxies at 400 million years, according to their timetable. 400 million years old, which actually predates when they should have been formed that much, and also now they found other items that predate the actual Big Bang, and it's like, well, there you go. The evidence is throwing them all into a tizzy, and they're spending enormous amounts of energy trying to salvage the hypothesis, right? Okay. Or you look up these mathematical models, and so then in the end, what you have to do is you have to start introducing all sorts of things that are just absurd. They're just literally fairy tales, like string theory. You know, next thing you find out there's string theory. Then there's dark matter, right? So, because why? You backed yourself into a corner based on your hypothesis, and your mathematics is based on your hypothesis, so then you back yourself into a corner because it doesn't work. And so then you have to do Deus ex machina. That Deus ex machina basically means you have to throw in something in order to solve the problem. So they throw in dark matter or time or what have you in order to solve the problem. Okay. So evolution, string theory, dark matter, they don't have sufficient evidence to conclude with any degree of certitude with this. This becomes a bigger problem. I mean, we even saw this in the vaccine things. I was just kind of watching the whole COVID thing with a bit of morbid fascination. And as I'm watching this, of course, we're going to leave the last one closed. So, but I mean, I'm not saying COVID doesn't exist, I'm not saying that. But I was just kind of watching. First of all, anytime the government and the news media constantly tells us something over and over and over and over and over again, I'm like, okay, that's a red flag, right? All right. So, but if you actually look, but you see this, that the principle of evidence, they try to certain degrees of certainty about stuff that we just didn't have. We used to flatten the curve, I mentioned before. But the real view was when they say those who get the vaccine, it actually ameliorates their symptomology in the hospitals. They said that before they had any statistical data whatsoever for it. And yet they were pushing it as more certain than it was. This is a problem. But the problem is, it's the same thing, you see this very same thing with evolution, where it's being pushed, and it's this mantra that has occurred for so long, and yet the evidence doesn't line out. So a corollary, so we get to the second thing, the corollary is, and this is the formulation that I use very often about, this is one of the formulations of the principle of evidence. A single piece of evidence, contrary to a theory, renders the theory in part or in whole false. Let me restate that again. A single piece of evidence, contrary to a theory, renders the theory in part or in whole false. This is based on the metaphysical fact that truth and being are one and the principle of non-contradiction. So you can't have contradictory pieces of evidence and your theory be true. It's contrary to the principle of non-contradiction, and it's based upon the very nature of being. This means that when we consider astrophysics or evolution, both evolution in the micro sense, that is, minor changes among animals, and the macro sense, and the life sciences in general, the statistical model simply does not apply. You can't drop evidence. Your theory or your hypothesis can only be true when it takes into consideration all of the evidence, all of it. For example, some of you have probably seen this. You can actually see the pictures online. In the Biloxi River, it's in Texas, I think. But anyway, there are tracks that were discovered in 1908 where there are human tracks inside of dinosaur tracks. And from the evidence, if you look at it, it looks like it suggests that the humans were tracking the dinosaur. If they were separated by hundreds of millions of years, that one piece of evidence simply should not exist, but it does. This discovery alone, based upon the principle of evidence, renders the stratification theories, the time theories that they say are all this, false, either in part or in whole. Period. Second, They actually find these still, to this day I've been told, in Pennsylvania in some of the coal mines. But the polystrate trees, these are upright fossilized trunks which push through many layers of rock, right? So if stratification happened over hundreds of millions of years, how do you get a tree that basically exists through literally hundreds of million, 2 to 300 million years of rock intact in that manner? It is impossible scientifically that it lasts that long. It's more reasonable to presume that it actually occurred together all at once. Stratification does not mean the time that they came from. In other words, what does this actually mean? The problem is that there are a variety of different explanations for stratification which would determine the times in which these things would actually occur. The days, and actually if you look at the flood, there is a great Protestants very often are doing more work in this than we are. But there is a great Protestant, it's a video in which they talk about, if you look very close attention to Genesis, the flood happened in 4 stages. And those 4 stages actually would correspond to why the stratification occurred and why you see different animals in their thing. In fact, one of the things they point out is if you look in Texas, what they found out is that the large dinosaur tracks were heading north. And they were heading north because the water table was rising. And they could tell they were walking in water. But they were heading north, and that's why they all ended, because as they headed north, they were going up in altitude, and that's actually why you see this conglomeration in Wyoming and in Montana and South Dakota of massive death fields for dinosaurs. They're just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dinosaurs in single fields. It's because it reached the level that they had all moved in that direction. The point being is that their theory of stratification does not provide the evidence, doesn't supply the certitude that they're trying to assert in relationship to this. Time, again, is one of those deus ex machina. We're not seeing anything really change right now. In fact, I have a theory, I could be proven wrong, but I have a theory. My theory is that one of the reasons that God is letting us see so much of the universe and see all these nooks and crannies and sending all these probes into various moons of various planets and scrolling out the planets because he wants to show us that the entire universe is sterile except here. And the reason it's sterile is precisely because of the fact that contained in matter itself is not a sufficient cause to create life in itself. It's a form that has to be imposed by God, and that's why we're only seeing it here. Another variant of the principle of evidence is whatever is objectively evident is true. Scientific studies and research being done with predetermined outcomes rather than the evidence is the death of science. It's going to kill it. And you see it, it's killing it. Every judgment must be based in evidence is another formulation of the principle of evidence. And that basically means, therefore, that in relationship to evolution, the judgment about the certitude and the truth of that hypothesis can only be done when you look at all of the evidence. All scientific conclusions must be based on all of the evidence. Any exclusion of evidence that does not fit one's theory nullifies the validity of the theory and calls into question the scientific basis of that theory. So if you actually look at the fact that they now have genetic entropy, that's one of the things they discovered, that mutations don't beget better things, they actually beget a bigger problem, and that we're actually declining. This is one of the reasons I tell people that, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are actually dumber, because they found out it's actually affecting our brains. We're dumber than our ancestors. And all you gotta do is turn on the TV and watch for 5 minutes if you know that. So that's the principle of evidence. The principle of evidence itself, just if you look at it, it gives you sufficient reason to recognize, okay, look at evolution has some serious issues. But then there's also the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason says that the existence of a thing is accountable either in itself or in another. What does that mean? Well, colloquially, you would say that you can't give what you don't have. The first time, I can't remember if it was Dawkins or Hawkins, I can't remember, I mentioned them, but obviously very distinct with their names. But one of them said, that the gap between something and nothing in the beginning was so infinitesimally small that it just jumped out into being. So, first of all, the gap between nothing and something is not small, it's infinite. That's why it takes an infinite power, it takes God to bring something into existence. Second, what's this it you're talking about? It doesn't exist. You just said there's nothing, so it doesn't exist, so that it can't pop out. So quit talking that way. I mean, even just the sentence, nothing, it popped into something, is irrational on the face of it. And yet they expect us to believe this. Without a doubt, this principle of sufficient reason is the most violated among the evolutionary theorists. Since one species does not have the existence of the essence in itself to be able to convert it to another species, it cannot be the cause of another species, their essence. Let me put it to you this way. If you don't have eyeballs, you can't give something eyeballs. It's that simple. People will say, well, there was a variety of different causes and they all came together. In fact, here's the problem. If you look at all of those causes and put them together, they still don't have sufficient a technical metaphysical phrase for saying they don't have enough to produce this thing that's higher than them. Because that thing that they're producing requires a level of organization that these things are not capable of producing on their own. You can throw in as many causes as you want. You can put all the chemicals you want in that primordial soup. You ain't going to come out with a bacteria. Because it can't produce it on its own. Well, that's why we have lightning. The lightning can't produce life. In fact, if you ever notice, lightning kills everything. Aside from problems with the Big Bang, evolution does not provide a sufficient reason for the existence of the species. Because it's saying that these lower things gave rise to something hot, something greater than even collectively. The greater, so this means that there has to be, it's called the principle of proportionate causality. There has to be a proportionate cause. If you're going to get A, well, you have to have something that has the same amount of existence, the same amount of perfection, the same kind of perfection as A. At least analogically, because God has all perfections contained in him, but it's done in an analogical fashion. And basically, the principle of proportionate causation says the effect cannot be greater than the cause. But that's exactly what evolution purports. It purports this primordial soup, which is just soup. It's just a conglomeration that gave rise to life. I'm using that by way of example. I'm sure they have more sophisticated ways of putting it down. But it's the same thing. Even in every single step of going from one species to another. We're not talking about changes within a species. Right? I mean, we can breed dogs and all sorts of different stuff out of them. So we do know that those things can change. Well, here we're talking about within a species. The cause, another variant of the principle of proportionate cause, is the cause must possess at least virtually whatever perfection it gives to the effect. You have to have it before you can give it. These people that deny that principle, I want to just walk up and say, give me $1 million. I don't have $1 million. Huh? So what? What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. You should be able to just pull that matter back. Because that's what you're telling me evolution does. By the way, if you got $1 million for pocket, I have a chapel I need to fill. Variants, another variant. Activities cannot surpass the perfection of the natures, forms, or powers which perform them. Very important. We can go over that one again. Activities cannot surpass the perfection of the natures, forms, and powers which perform them. This is why an ape can't give rise to a human being. Right? Because in itself, the perfections, natures, forms, and powers that the ape has are not proportionate to produce a human being, which is a higher thing. In the context of evolution, this is connected to the principle of sufficient reason, but it is formally different. In the case of the principle of sufficient reason, there has to be accountability relative to the existence of the thing, either in itself or another. But this principle indicates that an effect cannot be greater than the cause. In the case of macroevolution, the higher being, the effect, is greater than the cause. So this is something that's very key for us to keep and understand. Two or more causes that do not contain the perfection of the effect are not capable of producing the effect. We just know this. Then there's the principle of the integral good. So I'm going to give you the Latin. I'm going to break it down a bit, what it means. So the Latin is bonum ex integral causa, mal ex quacum effectum. Basically, good is from an integral cause. Evil from any defect whatsoever. And we know this, right? You can have somebody whose face is absolutely perfect, but if their nose is off to the side, you're like, okay, they're not beautiful, right? There's something off there. That's not good. We also know this, right? And this is something that's breaking down in our culture in general. The principle of the integral good is really breaking down because of the fact that people are psychologically isolating, they're ignoring the evidence, they're psychologically isolating things, and only focusing on the good little thing that they're getting out of it and ignoring what's actually really occurring. So let me give you an example. Now I use this example not because I have anything against these particular class of people. I kind of like them. But I always tell people, well look, let's just say for the sake of argument that I really like to see when people enjoy flying through the air. Right? And that's what my intention is to help this guy enjoy life. So I take a midget and I throw him off the top of the building. Right? My intention doesn't change the reality that I just murdered him. Right? And this is something that's very important. So in a moral act, the intention, what you're doing is called the object of the moral act, and the circumstances, all of them have to be good, or your act is morally bad. Right? And so this is something that's really important for us to see, that this principle of the integral good means that something is good precisely because its cause is integral. On the side of the cause, there's completeness to be able to bring about the effect. Scripture recounts, and God saw all the things that he made, and they were good. Good. Death is not good. The fact that you mentioned this, the fact that people say, that the evolutionists say, well, God used all this death and mayhem in order to bring us up to, there's so many different problems with evolution, but this is just one of them, that God used it. It's contrary to what we know in Scripture. In Scripture, the fact that what God made was good means that the principle of the good also applies to creation. We read in St. Thomas that since the completion, which is according to the integrity of the parts of the universe, integrity, which means in its wholeness, the completion, which is according to the wholeness of the parts of the universe, suits the sixth day. The consummation, which is according to operation of the parts, suits the seventh. Okay. Or it's able to be said that in a continuous motion, sometimes something is able to be moved further. It is not called perfect motion before the quiet, for the quiet demonstrates the completion of motion. God was able to make more creatures other than those which he made in the sixth day. Hence it is said that his work was completed when he ceased to create new creatures on the seventh day, unquote. What St. Thomas is saying is that the work of creation ceased at the end of the sixth day. Scripture essentially reveals that creation ended, bringing new beings into existence on the sixth day. And then on the seventh day, God rested, and it is a time that providence and conservation of being begin. So he creates, and then he preserves them in being and provides for them. This means that the diversity of creatures which we find in the created order is due to God's creative activity, which ceased on the sixth day, which does not envision an evolutionary process, nor just because, as we saw above, that there are no secondary causes in the act of creation. In other words, you can't, a secondary cause, a created cause, I mentioned that to bring something from nothing to existence is an infinite gap, requires an infinite power, and only God can do that. So no secondary cause, no human being, nothing is capable of, as a secondary cause, being able to bring something into existence that didn't exist before. Given what is revealed, theistic evolution cannot be tenable insofar as creation is an act of God and terminates at a certain point. And thus, the theistic evolution is subject to the criticism of violation of the first metaphysical principles. We're going to see this as we go on. Also, given what is revealed, the theistic evolution is untenable insofar as there has to be constant miracles. That's what I'm going to deal with later. St. Thomas observes that the first perfection, which is the integrity, so it's good, in its wholeness, was in the first institution of things. It's in the very beginning. For St. Thomas, the cessation of creative activity on the side of God and the fact that creation was good means that creation of God was intricately good. So that basically means that when God created, he doesn't mess up. He doesn't do it half-baked, and he doesn't do it in a manner that requires natural and physical evils. When considering the perfection or good of God's creation, one is left with a twofold distinction. The first has to do with the perfection of the individual parts of creation in which, in themselves, they are all perfect in their institution, that is, when they're created. So in the very beginning, they're brought into perfection. The second is how all the individual parts come together to constitute a perfect creation. The principle of the integral good indicates that all the parts must be good in order for the thing to be considered good in its totality. Therefore, the evolutionary hypothesis is untenable for the following two reasons. One, according to the evolutionary hypothesis, the initial creation of God was not integrally good as to the totality of creation because it was incomplete. In effect, the gradation of being, which is also called the principle of gradation of being, had gaps which indicated the totality of creation was not integrally good. God did not create a good creation. That's what they're telling us. The parts were also not integrally good insofar as they were evolving, and we must say mutating in various degrees and steps without being complete in themselves. So putting aside the fact that the mutation is generally bad for something, the fact is that God would have created something that is constantly striving for completion, not in him, but in the completion of themselves. This means that creation did not possess the good integrally. So what does this basically mean? It means that God, if you look at how it's revealed in Scripture, and if you actually look at every single thing that he gets involved in, whenever he is the sole cause, or whenever the secondary cause does not block him from perfectly acting through him, he acts as an integral cause. Everything, so when he acts, God is pure goodness. He's infinite goodness. He is infinite perfection. That means when he causes something, there is never a lack of perfection or good in the nature of that thing. He is an integral cause. And so to assert that he is not an integral cause, and by basically saying that there were defects in the beginning that had to be worked out, is quite frankly against the very nature of God. It's against the very nature of metaphysical reasoning. Death, as you said, only enters after the sin of Adam. To use death indicates that God would not be an integral cause in bringing things into existence, since things would be imperfect. So God always acts as an integral cause. By the way, this is how we know that the Catholic Church is the only divinely established means of salvation. How? It has all four of the causes. One, Holy Catholic Apostolic. No other religion, none, has any of those four causes independently of each other integrally. None of them. None. And this is how we know that the Catholic Church is from God. The point being is that this problem of teaching God
saying that God uses evil in order to bring good out of it, that's post-fall because of us. But to say that he introduced things and he created things in a non-physical cause, A, it doesn't hold up metaphysically, and B, quite frankly, it's the height of impiety. It's basically ascribing to God imperfection in his activity. Then there is the principle of economy. Now, the principle of economy basically states that an explanation that accounts for all the facts in terms of a single or few principles is preferable to a more complex theory. You can boil it down to this: the simplest explanation is usually the best. Okay. One of the problems with evolution is that it ends up multiplying causes. You have to have all sorts of causes in order to bring this thing to the perfection that it actually is. Putting aside the fact that the evidence doesn't stack up, as I mentioned, genetic entropy of itself negates the totality of the evolutionary hypothesis, quite frankly, in my estimation. Could be wrong, but the fact is that you have to have all these causes over and over and over and over again, rather than just God bringing the thing into existence at once. In other words, evolution ends up having to assert that a number of different mutations must occur in order for something to reach a stage where it's actually useful to a particular creature that displays change from which the mutations are ordered. Each mutation must come generally from a different cause or from the same cause on a number of different occasions, and this itself multiplies the number of principles or causes and makes the theory more complex. Therefore, it violates the principle of economy. This is also true even in relationship to theistic evolution. The variant of this principle of economy, which states that an explanation of a phenomenon is regarded as better or truer in which the minimum number of factors, the fewer steps in the process, and more immediate causes are included. That's how it's formulated. The simpler and more likely to be the case. This variant of the principle of economy connects with what we stated immediately above in a more explicit way. Since in some theories of evolution there are millions of years required to gradually produce a set of characteristics in living things. By the way, the more time you introduce it, of course it gets, is if you actually are taking a look at it seriously. Steps are added in a process which are not necessary to postulate in order to give an adequate explanation. This is because God suffices. It doesn't mean that God doesn't use secondary causes, but this is after the initial creation. That's part of the conservation of the being or the preservation, the providential side of things. Nor is it necessary to appeal to any kind of revelation in order to actually come to this conclusion. St. Thomas, being preeminent among the scholastics, said that every essence is immediately created by God and cannot be caused by any created substance. He shows that. He does a pretty good job in demonstrating that, which I've mentioned. It is also clear that we begin to realize that the theistic evolution has difficulties. In this case, we run up against a bit of a problem in the literature. Some theistic evolutionists hold that evolution is just a natural process used by God to bring about various forms of life, which then becomes just subject to the criticisms that I've already given, and others. Other theistic evolutionists hold that evolution is a case of constant miracles, because they recognize that for sufficient reason, all these natural causes can't produce higher effects, and so God has to step in and add it. But what the problem is that they introduce God into the issue to provide what might be lacking in the order of nature. It's a deus ex machina solution again. Such as the order that one finds in the universe, which may not be accounted for by purely natural causes. And this introduces above the philosophical difficulty where only God can create a substance. Some theistic evolutionists may even be motivated by religious reasons in order to give credibility to the scriptures. In other words, they say, well, we can't believe the scriptures, and so as a result, which I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, we can't believe the scriptures. So we have to, at least give some explanation that would make sure that they're compatible. Or they do it in order to make God is not completely excluded, as we see in the case of some theistic evolutionary theory. They just want God to be part of it. Theistic evolution in this sense succumbs to different difficulties. It is a natural process used by God. Then all of the above violations of principle would likewise be applied in this case that I just mentioned. If God is used to supply on the side of the principle of sufficient reason, it ends up violating the principle of economy, because God must intervene to supply the sufficient reason at each step. This indicates that it is not strictly a natural process, but requires the introduction of God into each step to be able to achieve the next higher species in the evolutionary process. This violates the principle of economy because what is ultimately being stated is that nature does not suffice in order to produce each individual species on its own. This is true enough in principle, but theistic evolution requires God to be involved at each individual step, since the laws of nature do not suffice. At each step, therefore, God must suspend the laws of nature. That is the definition of a miracle. God must suspend the laws of nature and add what's lacking in the order of nature. The definition of a miracle is something occurring aside from the whole created nature. It's something that's above and beyond the order. If you look at these natural causes, they don't have the ability to be able to beget this thing. Theistic evolution, whether it states that in its natural process, is really just a covert way of introducing constant miracles, or asserts outright that miracles are constantly necessary for the process, violate the principle of economy. It violates the principle of economy because it causes a number of causes, in this case, God intervening constantly in order to bring this thing up. Quite frankly, I would think God would say, that just sounds pretty tedious. I shouldn't be so flippant. God creates directly all the individual species in a short period of time without a large number of secondary causes, more perfectly fulfills the principle of economy than any theory of evolution, theistic evolution included. We already know that God must be part of this on a purely metaphysical level, since to go from nothing to something requires an infinite power. Regardless of whether one holds to the Aristotelian theory that the world has always existed, or whether one holds to what we know by revelation, that God created these things out of nothing from the beginning, does not matter. While we know from revelation God did create everything ex nihilo, and it's a formally defined doctrine of the church, St. Thomas points out that even if one holds that the world always existed, God had to be the cause in relationship to the essence of this. Modern science has lost its moorings. If you are going to proceed in the science violating the first principles, you're disconnecting yourself from the reality, because reality functions according to the first principles. If the reality is things don't contradict themselves, reality is that evidence determines what we should ultimately think and whether our thought is true or not. Not all scientists. In fact, one of the things that's frustrating a lot of the scientists is that serious guys that are trying to do serious science, they're trying to follow the proper methodology, following these first principles, etc., are getting more and more frustrated because of the fact that everybody that's proposing all the different ways to gain funding and things of that sort, or all the people that are signed off on the agenda, and all the things that they know need to be investigated are being investigated. But it's lost its reasoning by rejecting the first principles. We've entered into a new dark age, so to speak. And by that I mean that modern science, by deviating from the first principles, by deviating from sound philosophy, has reached a point where the stuff that's coming out is not advancing the science. Our technology might be advancing to some degree, but our scientific understanding of the causes of these things is not advancing. It's degrading. It's getting worse. And this is something in which, until the evolutionary hypothesis is abandoned as one of those things in the modern scientists' ideas that does not fulfill first principles and does not have sufficient evidence and does not have certitude, until they abandon that, we're not going to see the sciences get off the ground. The same thing, that's why I said at the beginning, the same set of principles, principle of evidence, that same principle behind why we know a man cannot have children is the same principle that nullifies evolution hypothesis. It's the same thing. This is why we're seeing it. But what it tells us is that evolution began the process of detaching people's moorings in scientific moorings, their connection to reality. This is why it's taught so heavily in colleges, universities, universities, etc. Because if you can get people disconnected from the evidence regarding the truth of a scientific hypothesis, you can feed them anything you want them to believe.